The doctors told me my lung had collapsed, and I had only minutes left before it became fatal. I called my mother from the emergency room. She answered, but instead of asking if I was alive, she asked why I was ruining her spa weekend. 3 weeks later, my father's final letter arrived, and everything she had spent years protecting disappeared in a single afternoon. The doctors told me later that I had been less than 20 minutes away from permanent damage. At the time, all I knew was that every breath felt like someone was driving a knife deeper into my chest. I collapsed onto the cold hospital floor, struggling to pull air into my lungs while nurses rushed toward me. Bright lights blurred above my head as someone shouted, "She's losing oxygen. Move, now." The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens, oxygen masks, and terrified faces. I kept trying to stay awake. Not because I was brave. Because I wasn't ready to die. When I finally opened my eyes again, I was lying in the emergency room. Tubes surrounded me, monitors beeped steadily, and a doctor stood beside my bed with a serious expression. "My name is Dr. Collins," he said gently. "Your left lung collapsed. We were able to stabilize you, but you need emergency surgery immediately." I nodded weakly. There wasn't enough air in my chest to ask questions. A nurse placed my phone beside me. "If there's someone you want to call," she whispered, "now would be a good time." There was only one person I wanted. My mom. No matter how complicated our relationship had been over the years, I still believed that when your child was lying in a hospital bed fighting to breathe, nothing else mattered. With trembling fingers, I pressed her name. She answered on the 4th ring. "Lily," she said casually. For one brief second, I felt relieved. "Mom." I whispered through the oxygen mask. "I'm in the hospital." "Oh." Her voice sounded distracted. In the background. I could hear soft music, people laughing, and the sound of water. "I'm having emergency surgery." There was a short silence. Then she sighed. "Lily, seriously?" I frowned. "What?" "You know your father and I finally booked this spa weekend after 6 months." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I can't breathe." Another sigh. "The doctors are already helping you, aren't they?" I stared at the ceiling. "Yes." "Then what exactly do you expect me to do?" My eyes slowly filled with tears. "I thought, maybe, you would come." She laughed softly. "Honey, you're 31 years old. You'll be fine. I already paid nearly $3,000 for this resort. If we leave now, we'll lose everything." My heart hurt far more than my lungs. I just wanted my mom. For the first time in my life. She didn't answer. Instead she said, "Please don't ruin our weekend over something the doctors are already handling." Then, she hung up. I kept staring at the dark phone screen. The nurse standing beside me quietly picked it up without saying a word. She didn't need to. The expression on her face told me she had heard enough. Minutes later, I was wheeled towards surgery. As the operating room doors opened, I looked around one last time. Every patient beside me had someone waiting. A husband. A wife. Parents. Children. Someone holding their hand. My chair rolled forward alone. When I woke several hours later, my chest burned with every breath. The surgery had been successful. The doctor smiled. "You made it." I whispered the first question that came into my mind. "Did my parents come?" The nurse hesitated. Then quietly shook her head. "No." She smiled kindly. "But someone else did." Confused, I watched as my best friend Sarah walked into the room carrying a small paper bag and a bottle of water. The moment she saw me awake, tears filled her eyes. "You scared me half to death." She carefully hugged me. Without touching my bandaged chest. I came as soon as the hospital called. I looked toward the empty doorway behind her. "They're not coming, are they?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled a chair beside my bed. Then she reached into her purse and handed me her phone. "I didn't want you to see this before surgery." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" She opened social media. There. On my mother's Facebook page. Was a smiling selfie. She stood beside a luxury swimming pool wearing a white robe, sunglasses, and holding a glass of sparkling wine. The caption read, "Finally enjoying the peaceful spa weekend we deserve. Life is too short not to treat yourself." Posted. 23 minutes after hanging up on me. I stared at the screen until the words became blurry. Not because of the medication. Because my eyes filled with tears. Sarah quietly locked her phone. You don't deserve this. I tried to smile. I kept telling myself that one day she'd choose me. Sarah squeezed my hand. Lily. Sometimes people tell us exactly who they are. We're just too hopeful to believe them. I closed my eyes. For years I had ignored every broken promise. Every forgotten birthday. Every canceled dinner. Every excuse. Because she was my mother. I believed that when life became serious, everything would change. But lying in that hospital bed with stitches across my chest and machines helping me breathe, I finally understood something I had spent 31 years refusing to accept. The hardest battles aren't always against illness. Sometimes, they're against the people who should have loved you the most. And I had no idea that this painful day was only the beginning. 3 weeks later, my father's final letter would reveal a truth that would change my family forever. Growing up, I never believed my mother loved me less. I just believed I always came second. As a child, I made excuses for her. If she forgot my birthday, she was busy. If she missed my school play, she was tired. If she praised someone else instead of me, she probably didn't realize how much it hurt. Children are experts at protecting the people who disappoint them. Looking back now, I realize the signs had always been there. My name is Lily Carter, and for as long as I can remember, I was the responsible child. I graduated from college without asking my parents for money. I worked 2 jobs while finishing my medical training. I bought my first car with cash. I never called home asking for help. Instead, I was usually the one helping everyone else. Whenever my parents' washing machine broke, I paid to replace it. When the roof started leaking after a storm, I hired the contractor. When Dad's old pickup truck needed expensive repairs, I quietly covered the bill without expecting anyone to know. I never kept score. Because I believed that's what family did. My father, Robert Carter, always thanked me. He wasn't a man of many words. He worked nearly 40 years as an electrician. His hands were rough. His back constantly hurt. But every time I visited, he would squeeze my shoulder and say, "I'm proud of you, kid." Those 4 words meant everything. My mother, Linda, was different. She cared deeply about appearances. The house always had to look perfect. The neighbors always had to think our family was successful. Every vacation had to be posted online. Every restaurant had to be expensive enough for pictures. She measured happiness by what strangers thought, not by what her family felt. When I became a respiratory therapist, I thought she would finally be proud. Instead, she smiled politely and asked, "So, when are you going to get a real promotion?" I laughed awkwardly. She didn't. To her, helping sick people wasn't impressive. Driving a luxury SUV was. Owning designer handbags was. Being invited to expensive charity dinners was. I stopped trying to impress her years ago. At least, I told myself I had. The truth was different. Every time my phone rang with Mom on the screen, a small part of me still hoped today's conversation would be different. Maybe today she would ask how I was doing. Maybe today she'd thank me. Maybe today she'd say she was proud. But she never did. Instead, every phone call ended the same way. "Lily, could you help us with one more thing?" And I always said yes. Because saying no to family felt impossible. 3 months before my surgery, Dad quietly admitted they were struggling financially. His retirement savings had almost disappeared because of unexpected medical treatments. Without telling Mom, he asked if I could lend them a little money. I transferred $5,000 that same afternoon. When I visited the following weekend, Mom was showing her friends a brand new outdoor furniture set. "It was on sale," she said proudly. I smiled. Only Dad looked uncomfortable. Later that evening, while Mom was inside making coffee, Dad pulled me aside on the back porch. "I'm going to pay you back." I smiled. "You don't have to." His eyes filled with guilt. "I hate asking you." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "You've spent your whole life taking care of me. It's my turn." He nodded quietly. Neither of us noticed Mom standing near the kitchen window watching us. The next morning, she casually mentioned wanting to book a luxury mountain spa resort. "It's expensive," she laughed. "But your father deserves to relax." Dad looked surprised. "We can't afford that." She smiled confidently. "We'll figure it out." At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I know exactly where part of my money went. A week later, Mom proudly uploaded photos announcing their upcoming luxury vacation. Hundreds of people commented. "You deserve it." Goals. What a beautiful couple. I stared at those smiling pictures. No one knew their daughter had quietly paid for everything. And honestly, I didn't want the credit. I just wanted honesty. As summer turned into autumn, Dad's health became worse. He became tired more easily. He coughed often. Sometimes he looked 20 years older than he actually was. Whenever I suggested another doctor, Mom always answered first. "He's fine. Stop worrying so much. You're always making everything sound dramatic." But I wasn't imagining it. Working in healthcare teaches you to notice the small things. Weight loss. Breathing changes. Constant exhaustion. Dad was getting worse. Deep inside, I knew something wasn't right. Still, every Sunday I drove 40 minutes to visit them. I'd bring groceries. Fix whatever was broken around the house. Cook dinner. Then quietly leave before dark because I had another hospital shift the next morning. As I drove home one Sunday evening, Dad walked me to my car. Before I got inside, he stopped me. "Lily." I turned around. He hesitated for several seconds, as though he wanted to tell me something important. Finally, he smiled sadly. "I hope you know. You've always had the biggest heart in this family." I laughed. "That's random." He shook his head. "No. It's important." I hugged him tightly before getting into my car. Neither of us knew. That would be the last time I would ever hug my father while he was healthy. Only a few weeks later, I would be lying in a hospital bed fighting for my own life. And just 1 month after that, I would be standing beside his grave, holding a letter that would expose a family secret my mother had spent years trying to hide. 3 weeks after I left the hospital, I was finally beginning to feel like myself again. The stitches across my chest still hurt every morning. Taking a deep breath reminded me that my body wasn't fully healed. But emotionally, I was trying to move forward. I had stopped expecting phone calls from my mother. She texted twice after my surgery. The first message simply said, "Hope you're feeling better." The second asked, "Can you recommend a good doctor for your father? He's been tired lately." No apology. No visit. No explanation. Just another request. I answered anyway. Because that's what I'd always done. A few days later, Dad called me himself. His voice sounded weaker than I had ever heard it. "Lily. I don't think I'm getting any better." That sentence terrified me. I drove to my parents' house that evening after work. Dad was sitting quietly on the back porch. He looked thinner. His hands trembled slightly as he held a cup of coffee. For the first time in my life, he looked old. I sat beside him without saying anything. Sometimes silence says more than words ever can. After a few minutes, he smiled. "You've always known when something was wrong." I looked at him carefully. "Dad, we need to get you back to the hospital." He nodded. "I know." Then he looked toward the kitchen window where Mom was talking on the phone. "Your mother thinks I'm worrying too much." I sighed. She thought the same thing when my lung collapsed. Dad lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry." Those 2 words stopped me. "What are you apologizing for?" He swallowed slowly. "For not protecting you." I frowned. "Dad." He shook his head. "There are things I should have said years ago." Before I could ask what he meant, Mom walked outside carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. The conversation ended immediately. Dad smiled like nothing had happened. I didn't realize it then. But that was his goodbye point. 2 weeks later. My phone rang at 5:43 in the morning. Hospitals rarely call before sunrise with good news. The moment I answered, I knew. Dad had suffered a massive heart attack during the night. The doctors tried everything. He never woke up. I don't remember driving to the hospital. I don't remember signing paperwork. I don't remember the funeral arrangements. Grief has a strange way of stealing pieces of time. Everything becomes quiet. Slow. Heavy. The funeral was held 4 days later. Friends. Neighbors. Former coworkers. People I had never met came to pay their respects. Everyone described my father the same way. Hardworking. Honest. Kind. I stood beside his casket wondering why kind people sometimes stayed silent when silence hurt the people they loved. Mom cried constantly. People hugged her. Told her how strong she was. I hugged her too. Not because everything was forgiven. Because Dad would have wanted me to. Just as the service ended, a man in a gray suit approached me. Miss Carter? Yes. My name is David Reynolds. I'm your father's attorney. I looked confused. My father had a lawyer? He hired me 6 months ago. He handed me a thick cream-colored envelope. Across the front, written in my father's familiar handwriting, were 5 simple words. For Lily. After I'm gone. My hands immediately began shaking. When did he write this? David answered quietly. Several months before his death, he made me promise this letter would only be given to you. I stared at the envelope for several long seconds. Mom noticed. What is that? The lawyer answered before I could. Private instructions from Mr. Carter. She frowned. Private? He never mentioned anything. David simply nodded. He wanted it that way. That evening, I drove home alone. The envelope sat on my passenger seat the entire drive. I couldn't bring myself to open it. Part of me wasn't ready to hear my father's final words, but another part desperately needed them. Finally, I made a cup of tea, sat at my kitchen table, and carefully broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper smelled faintly like Dad's workshop. Motor oil, coffee, and old cedar wood. The first line immediately brought tears to my eyes. My dearest Lily, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer here to tell you these things myself. I wiped my eyes and continued reading. First, I need you to know something I should have told you years ago. I have always been proud of you. Not because of your job. Not because of your success. But because no matter how unfair life became, you never stopped choosing kindness. My tears landed on the paper. Dad continued. I watched you help this family over and over again. You paid bills you never talked about. You repaired things without asking for credit. You loved us even when we didn't deserve it. Then, I reached the sentence that completely changed everything. There is something you don't know. Months ago, I quietly changed my will. My heartbeat quickened. I kept reading. Everything I truly owned has been legally transferred into your name. Not because I love anyone else less. But because you were the only person who never loved me for what I could give you. I stopped breathing for a moment. Everything? The house. The lake cabin. His investment account. Even the small workshop he had built with his own hands. Dad had left it all. To me. Then came one final paragraph. A paragraph that would change my family forever. Your mother doesn't know. She believes everything belongs to her. Please don't fight her. Just let the truth speak for itself. One day, everyone will finally see who you really are. I folded the letter carefully against my chest. For the first time since losing him. I smiled through my tears, but I had no idea what would happen 48 hours later. When my mother invited the entire family to hear the reading of Dad's will, completely convinced she was about to inherit everything. To inherit everything. 2 days after I read Dad's letter, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice sounded strangely cheerful. Lily, the lawyer wants everyone at my house tomorrow afternoon. Why? To go over your father's estate. She laughed softly. I'm sure it's just paperwork. I'll finally be able to organize everything. I simply answered. I'll be there. Then I hung up. I didn't mention the letter. I didn't mention the will. And I definitely didn't tell her I already knew what Dad had done. That night I barely slept. Not because I was excited. Because I knew tomorrow would change everything. The next afternoon, I pulled into my parents' driveway. The house looked exactly the same. Dad's old pickup truck still sat beside the garage. His gardening gloves still rested on the porch railing. For a moment, I forgot he was gone. Then reality hit me again. Inside, the living room was already full. My Aunt Susan sat quietly on the couch. My Uncle Mark poured himself coffee in the kitchen. A few close family friends had stopped by to support Mom. Everyone looked tired, everyone except Linda. She was wearing a brand new designer dress. Her makeup was flawless. She greeted everyone with confident smiles. I know Robert wanted me to stay strong, she kept saying. Several relatives nodded sympathetically. Watching her, You would never guess that only weeks earlier she had refused to leave a luxury spa while her daughter fought for her life. At exactly 2 o'clock, Attorney David Reynolds walked through the front door carrying a thick leather folder. He shook everyone's hand before taking a seat. Thank you all for coming. He opened the folder carefully. As requested by Robert Carter, his final wishes will now be read. The room became completely silent. Mom folded her hands confidently in her lap. I noticed her glancing around the room with the quiet confidence of someone who believed she already knew the outcome. David adjusted his glasses. Before discussing financial matters, Mr. Carter left a short statement for his family. He unfolded a handwritten page. Then he began reading. If you're hearing these words, then I have already said goodbye. Several relatives quietly wiped away tears. David continued. I loved my family more than I ever learned how to express. Mom nodded slowly. Then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere. I also know that silence can become its own kind of failure. I lowered my eyes. Those words sounded exactly like my father. Quiet. Honest. Painfully true. David continued reading. For years I watched one person quietly carry burdens no one else noticed. Mom's smile faded slightly. David looked toward me. Then continued. She fixed what was broken. She gave without asking for recognition. She stayed when walking away would have been easier. The room became noticeably uncomfortable. My aunt glanced toward me. Uncle Mark slowly lowered his coffee cup. Mom shifted in her chair. David placed the letter down. Now we will review Mr. Carter's estate. Mom immediately smiled again. She crossed one leg over the other. Almost as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. David opened another folder. According to the updated legal documents signed 6 months ago. He paused. The family home. Mom nodded confidently. Has already been transferred. Another pause. To Lily Carter. The room froze. Nobody spoke. Mom blinked twice. I'm sorry. What did you just say? David remained calm. The house legally belongs to Lily. Mom laughed nervously. There must be some mistake. There isn't. He continued. The lakeside cabin has also been transferred to Lily Carter. Mom's smile completely disappeared. Her breathing became heavier. David continued reading, the investment account. The workshop. The savings certificates. The retirement portfolio. Silence. Absolute silence. I could actually hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Mom slowly stood up. This is impossible. I've been his wife for 33 years. David calmly slid several signed documents across the table. These were witnessed, notarized, and legally filed months before Mr. Carter passed away. She grabbed the papers with shaking hands. No. No. He wouldn't do this. Her voice cracked. There has to be another version of the will. David shook his head. This is the only legal version. My aunt quietly whispered. Oh my goodness. Mom turned toward me. You knew. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked down at my father's wedding photo sitting on the fireplace. Then I quietly replied. I found out after the funeral. You lied to me. I stayed silent. That's the same thing. Before I could answer, David spoke again. There is one final instruction from Mr. Carter. Everyone turned toward him. He unfolded another handwritten page. This message is specifically for Linda. Mom stared at him without blinking. David began reading. Linda. If you're angry today, I understand. But before you blame Lily, please remember every moment she quietly carried this family while asking for nothing in return. Mom's face turned pale. David continued. When Lily was in the hospital fighting for her life, she needed her mother. You chose a vacation instead. Several relatives exchanged shocked looks. No one had known. David continued. That was the day I realized I had spent too many years pretending everything was fine. Mom covered her mouth. Tears began running down her face. But no one moved to comfort her. The room remained completely still. Finally, she looked directly at me. Her voice barely above a whisper. Lily. I never thought. I calmly interrupted her. No. You just never chose to think about me. For the first time in years. She had no answer. And deep inside, I realized something. This wasn't revenge. This was simply the truth finally catching up with years of silence. No one spoke for several seconds. The room felt heavy. Even the old grandfather clock seemed louder than before. My mother was still standing in the middle of the living room, holding the will with trembling hands. She looked around as if someone would defend her. No one did. For the first time in years, there wasn't a single excuse waiting for her. Attorney David Reynolds quietly closed the folder. My responsibility here is complete. He nodded respectfully and walked toward the front door. Before leaving, he looked at me. Your father was very proud of you. Those 7 words hit harder than I expected. After everything. After all the silence. Dad had been proud. He had simply waited too long to say it. As soon as the front door closed, my mother turned toward me. You manipulated him. Her voice cracked with anger. You filled his head with lies. I looked at her calmly. I barely saw Dad during his last year. You poisoned him against me. Aunt Susan finally stood up. Linda. Stop. Mom looked shocked. What? Susan folded her arms. I visited Robert almost every week. He never complained. But he worried. He worried about Lily. He worried that nobody noticed everything she quietly did. Mom stared at her own sister. You knew? Susan nodded. I knew more than you think. Uncle Mark cleared his throat. I didn't want to get involved. But Robert talked to me too. He asked me one question. Everyone looked toward him. He asked, if something happened to me today, who would still take care of Lily? Mark looked directly at Mom. I didn't know how to answer him. Silence returned. This time, it felt even heavier. My cousin Emily quietly walked over to me. She wrapped her arms around me. I never knew. I'm so sorry. One by one, other relatives began walking toward me. Some hugged me. Some apologized. Some simply squeezed my hand. Nobody had realized what had really happened after my surgery. They only knew the version Mom always told, that everything had been under control. That she had been there. Now, they finally knew the truth. My mother watched every single person move toward me instead of her. The attention she had always expected was disappearing. Slowly. Quietly. Completely. She whispered. I didn't mean to hurt you. I answered honestly. I believe that. She looked relieved. Then I continued. But not meaning to hurt someone doesn't erase years of hurting them. The relief disappeared from her face. She sat down on the couch. For the first time. She looked small. Not powerful. Not confident. Just tired. She quietly asked. When did I become this person? Nobody answered. Because everyone in the room knew. Only she could answer that question. A few minutes later, the front door opened again. It was our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Wilson. She had brought a casserole for the family. She immediately noticed the silence. Is everything all right? Nobody responded. Finally, Aunt Susan smiled sadly. We're finally telling the truth. Mrs. Wilson slowly placed the casserole on the kitchen counter. Then she looked at me. Oh, Lily. I've wanted to say something for years. I frowned. What do you mean? She smiled gently. Every Tuesday after work. I used to see your car parked outside your parents' house. You'd carry groceries inside. Sometimes medicine. Sometimes flowers. You never stayed long. You always left before anyone noticed. Mom looked at me. Confused. Mrs. Wilson continued. I always assumed your mother knew. I quietly shook my head. No. I never told her. I didn't want credit. Another long silence. My mother slowly covered her face. Tears slipped through her fingers. You still came. I nodded. Every week. You still helped us. Yes. Even after the spa? Yes. Her shoulders began shaking. I don't deserve that. No. You probably don't. The room stayed completely silent. Nobody thought my answer was cruel. Because it was true. About 30 minutes later, everyone slowly began leaving. Before Aunt Susan walked out, she hugged me tightly. Your father would be proud today. I smiled for the first time all afternoon. I hope so. When the house finally became quiet, only Mom and I remained. She looked around the living room. Dad's favorite chair. His reading glasses. The family photographs. Everything suddenly looked different. Not because the house had changed. Because the truth had finally entered it. She quietly asked, "What happens now?" I looked around the home Dad had trusted me to protect. I don't know. But I know one thing. I'm done living like I don't matter. She slowly nodded. For once. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply accepted the words. That evening, as I locked the front door, I realized something unexpected. Winning never felt the way people imagined. There was no celebration. No cheering. No revenge. Only peace. The kind of peace that comes when you stop begging people to see your worth. Because you finally see it yourself. 3 months passed. Winter arrived quietly. The trees around the lake had lost their leaves, and the air carried that familiar cold smell my father always loved. Life looked different now. I had officially moved into my new position as community health coordinator at the hospital. For the first time in almost 10 years. I wasn't working overnight shifts. I could finally eat breakfast while watching the sunrise instead of driving home exhausted. My patients still needed me. But now I had time to breathe. Time to live. And maybe time to heal. The house Dad left me didn't feel like a prize. It felt like a responsibility. Every room reminded me of him. His favorite chair still faced the fireplace. His old fishing hat still hung beside the back door. Sometimes I caught myself expecting to hear him whistling from the garage. Grief doesn't disappear. It simply becomes quieter. One Saturday morning, I found a small wooden box inside Dad's workshop. I had somehow missed it before. Inside were dozens of photographs. Pictures of me as a little girl. School plays. Birthday parties. My first bicycle. High school graduation. Nursing school. Every milestone. On the back of almost every photo, Dad had written a date. Sometimes only one sentence. Our brave girl. She never gives up. So proud today. By the time I reached the last picture, I couldn't stop crying. He had been proud all along. He simply never knew how to say it while he was alive. A week later, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Mom stood there. She looked different. No expensive jewelry. No perfect makeup. Just a heavy winter coat and tired eyes. She held a small apple pie. I made this. I smiled politely. Come in. She looked surprised. I wasn't sure you would let me. I wasn't sure either. We sat in the kitchen where Dad used to drink his morning coffee. For several minutes. Neither of us spoke. Finally Mom whispered. I started seeing a counselor. I looked up. She continued. I kept asking myself why I always chose appearances over people. She wiped away a tear. I finally realized. I spent so many years trying to look like the perfect wife and mother, that I forgot how to actually be one. Those words didn't erase the past. But they were honest. And honesty was something our family had avoided for decades. She slowly slid an envelope across the table. I've been writing this for weeks. What is it? My apology. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I asked the question that had lived inside me for years. When I was in the hospital. Why didn't you come? She closed her eyes. When your father called. I told myself the doctors already had everything under control. I convinced myself there wasn't anything I could do. She looked down. But the truth. I didn't want to interrupt my vacation. Hearing her finally admit it out loud hurt. But somehow, it also freed me. Because I would never again wonder whether I had imagined the pain. She had finally spoken the truth herself. I can't change that day, she whispered. I know. I can't ask you to forget. You shouldn't. I only hope that one day you'll remember me for more than my worst mistake. I looked out the kitchen window. Snow had started falling across the backyard. Dad used to say that fresh snow covered old footprints. But it never erased where they had been. Families worked the same way. A month later, I made a decision. I invited Mom to volunteer at the hospital's annual community health fair. Not because everything was fixed. Because healing needs action. Not promises. She spent the day handing out water bottles and greeting elderly patients. She never tried to take credit. She never interrupted anyone. She simply helped. Quietly. For the first time, I saw the mother I had wanted all my life. Not perfect. Just present. As spring arrived, the lake cabin became my favorite place to think. One evening I carried Dad's ashes there. The same dock where he had taught me to fish when I was 8 years old. The water was completely still. I smiled. You were right, Dad. I didn't need revenge. I just needed the truth. The wind carried softly across the lake. For a brief moment, it almost felt like he was there. 6 months after reading the will, our family gathered for dinner. Nothing fancy. Just homemade food. Simple conversation. No pretending. No competition. No invisible daughter sitting quietly in the corner. Mom looked across the table. I'm proud of you, Lily. Those words came years too late. But they were real. And sometimes, real is enough. I smiled. Thank you. Dad wasn't there to hear it. But somehow, I think he already knew. Before leaving that night, I placed Dad's final letter back inside the wooden box. Not because I wanted to hide it. Because I no longer needed to carry it every day. The truth had already done its job. If this story has taught me anything, it's this. The people who fail to see your worth do not get to decide your value. Keep showing kindness. Keep standing tall. Keep building a life you're proud of. Because one day, the truth has a way of speaking louder than years of silence. And when it finally does, you won't need revenge. Your life will become the answer.